Thank you guys all for coming tonight. This is a pretty cool opportunity that we get to see two very successful people talk to each other. I already mentioned some of the...
I'm sorry.
As you all know, I imagine you know, Jim Ball wrote Global Warming and the Risen Lord. You probably heard him this morning. He's a very successful man, very well known with the evangelical climate change community. So I'm very glad to welcome him this evening. Thank you so much for being here.
Great. All right. Well, it's great to be here. I already did this morning. You probably heard my jokes about my first time in San Diego and all that. So, palm trees and the oceans out there. So those quick recap of my jokes. So, so I don't know how funny or more funny I'm going to be this evening. So that might have been it. So, but I thought it would be helpful to give kind of a quick hit some quick highlights to lay a bit of a foundation for what I hope will be a great back and forth discussion. And I'm going to love to hear your questions and be able to have a dialogue with you. So again, great to be here. As you heard this morning, the most important fact there is about global warming is that it's the risen Lord who's leading the way and overcoming it. That's the most important fact. But one of my contentions is that global warming is an issue that no one in the United States is exempt from doing something about. As Christians, you may say, well, this or that issue is something that I hope some Christians are dealing with, but that's not my calling. That's not my issue. My contention is that for all of us, because we are associated with the, how global warming is coming about, that also then means that we need to be a part of overcoming it with the risen Lord. And that in fact, part of discipleship today for all Christians is walking with the risen Lord as He leads the way. I'm going to go over some of the major impacts that are going to happen to the poor to help you understand why I think that's the case. Why all Christians here in the United States are called to be a part of overcoming global warming. So, as I said this morning, there's going to be more floods and droughts. Those are the largest disasters that humanity faces, natural disasters, that are being intensified. But hunger and malnutrition are going to be increasing this century to possibly even over 500 million. But conservative estimates there are 40 to 170 million. Water scarcity, we're looking at 1 to 2 billion people facing, in water scarce areas, facing additional water scarcity. Coastal flooding, 100 million people are going to be impacted. There's going to be a lot of inland flooding, including here in the United States. Obviously, we've been having a lot of flooding. Just in the D.C. area, we've been having some flooding that's been a bit unusual. The inland flooding is hard for scientists to be able to model, and so those numbers, we can't really put some numbers to it. So we're just talking about on the coasts. Malaria, an additional 90 to 200 million more people will be vulnerable to malaria. Malaria is an interesting case because in some areas the incidences of malaria will go down. But for us as and collectively around the world, it could be the case that they stay about the same, maybe like 50 million more kind of thing. But what we as Christians are concerned about are, we're looking and saying, for those who haven't, the poor people who haven't been vulnerable, who are going to become more vulnerable? And that's the number here. Because we're concerned about those who are vulnerable. Climate refugees, by the middle of the century, about 200 million is a reasonable projection there. And then violent conflicts, billions of people are at risk in terms of that. So that's a quick highlight of the major impacts that we're going to see in this century, and why I contend that as Christians we need to be involved in this issue, all of us. So global warming is a natural disaster intensifier. You may know that, it's still playing, the old BASF, we don't make whatever, we make it better kind of thing. It's kind of the way with global warming. Global warming doesn't make the natural disaster, but it makes it more intense. It's a poverty intensifier because of the way that it's going to be doing all the things that I've already highlighted. It's a freedom denier because as all those impacts take place, it will, in many instances, help those who are climbing out of poverty just to have to go back down into poverty, or those who are in poverty already to they make their situation worse. So the economic dimension of freedom, it'll be a denier in that area, and to some degree a political dimension of freedom. It's also a freedom denier. But we have this tendency as human beings to be numbed by these numbers. And so as Christians, I wanted you to get a sense of it, to understand the magnitude of it. But there's that problem that we become numb to this situation. So that's why it's helpful for us to look at situations and talk about stories like I did this morning in terms of William Val, the climate change orphan. So when you start getting numbed about the numbers, just remember William Val. This is a slide that actually came from Val Sheen's presentation she made. The reason why William Val became an orphan, these are the reasons why. And when I was telling you the story, it was like, well, you had the reduction in the annual precipitation, you had the shortening of the rainy season, unpredictability of the rains, increased temperature, increased frequency of natural disasters of drought and flooding. All that happened in the story of Alice and William Val, and that's why William Val, in good measure, became an orphan. So there again is Val Sheen, the Christian missionary and veterinarian that I spoke about this morning. And I'm going to give you a little bit more information on the Karamanjong because it's a lead up to a video clip of an interview I did with Val. With the Karamanjong, there's, they're semi-nomadic tribe, or 7 sub-tribes. But one of the things that I didn't speak of this morning that Val really emphasized is that unfortunately all of the sub-tribes fight amongst each other, and then they fight with those who are outside of the Karamanjong. And many of them have weapons and AK-47s, and the government of Uganda up in that region is very weak and is not able to provide much security. So in some ways it's a bit of a lawless area. And what you have are young men who have been in some ways untethered from the authority of the elders, running around with AK-47s. And it's a very, very situation that's not a good one. This is what their villages will look like. Again, this is a security. You can see that the village, then they protect the village, and then you go out of the village, though, to raise your animals. Now, one of the problems with global warming is that folks are having to take their animals farther and farther away from the protected areas, and that makes them more vulnerable to attack. And that may be something that Val talks about. So, he's taking his animals out, but he's having to go farther from protection. So I think that sets me up for, let's go to Val. We need sound here. Let's see what happens. The elders are not being respected as much by the younger men, and the younger men unfortunately have AK-47s, and the government is not very strong and is not really able to provide security, and so that just, it sounds like a really kind of tough environment to be in. And obviously, if you add climate change into that mix, it makes it much worse. But actually, I want to ask you, you've been out there for nearly 20 years. And of course, we're not going to be seeing more problems, but you're going back. You're going to live there the rest of your life, probably. How is it that, what is it about your faith that has really brought you to the place where you're giving your life to this community and this area?
Well, it is a very difficult place to live. I can't say that it's easy. It's a place of struggle and a place of pain. And I think the biggest thing that's helped me to be able to be successful there in the way that I would call success is just surviving, is just to have a very close relationship with the Lord, just to draw close to Him and to walk through the suffering with the people, not to deny that it's there and not to withdraw from it. I live in a grass-thatched hut with the people. They come to my porch and they're dying, and I stay with them and I pray with them, and I love them. And by allowing myself to walk through that suffering with them, that helps them to grow. It helps them to see hope. I don't separate myself from them, but I let that pain be there and let God work through all of us. But that's what makes it work, because I can be Jesus for them right next to Him, and we're together in it.
Great. Well, we'll continue to pray for you. We're so thankful that you're out there and you have the love of Jesus in your heart and the courage of Jesus in your heart. You're a brave woman. Finally, what can Christians here in the United States, how can Christians in the United States be more aware of this issue of climate change and the need to help the poor adapt, but also how can we help your organization? How can Christians here in the United States actually help you in your ministry?
Well, I think a lot of what needs to be done is for people just to be aware that the problem is there and it's impacting people today. It's not just something we're going to worry about in the future, that, oh, it's going to give us some problems and cost us some money. It is impacting people today, and people are suffering. And as Christians, we have the responsibility and moral obligation to step out and say, I'm going to love these people. I'm not going to let them suffer like this. We have the opportunity to do that. We live in a country here in America where we have resources, we can help people. And to sit back and say, well, it's not my problem, I can just turn up my air conditioning, that's not going to solve the global problems. We need to be able to say that we are following after what God puts on our hearts, and not to ignore it, not to act like it's not a big deal. It is a big deal, and God's making us accountable to it today.
CBM USA, if you're wondering, her website. So if you're interested in her ministry and you'd like to support her, cvmusa.org. That stands for Christian Veterinary Mission.org. So, can global warming be overcome? And this is something that a third of my book is dedicated to answering this question, which we get a big yes there. Global warming can be overcome. I use this term of overcoming, and that's an intentional echo of the civil rights movement, because we shall overcome, the great civil rights hymn. Because it wasn't that there wasn't struggle, it wasn't that there wasn't suffering, It wasn't that there weren't difficulties and pain and setbacks. All of that occurred, but we did, in many respects, begin to overcome injustice in that regard in terms of racism. We still have a ways to go, but we've made incredible strides. So with global warming, there's still going to be pain and suffering, but can we get to a point where we've crested it? And the answer, I think, is yes, if we get started in a very serious way very quickly. So what we need to do to overcome the causes of global warming, we need to have a tenfold increase in carbon productivity in 40 years. That's a doable but daunting challenge. What's this going to cost? It's going to be about 2% of global GDP. And just as a comparison, the world spends 3.3% on insurance, not including life insurance. So it's quite affordable, actually. One of the ways we're going to be able to overcome the causes is our creative entrepreneurial spirit. And this is where Alt. All right. I want to show you a quick, not that it's good. Oh, here we go. Quick video about Bill Keith, the roofer that you just saw in the inventor. And I'll talk a little more about that.
Finally tonight, when President Obama traveled to Indiana today, he heard from a lot of people about jobs they've lost and futures in jeopardy. But there was a notable exception to that. One man talking to the president today who is determined to turn things around for employment and for the environment. Here's Bill Weir.
Beneath the migrating geese, across the street from the VFW Hall, there is a gray and white barn, green with ideas. It belongs to Bill Keith, the kind of eco-minded tinkerer who enjoys hooking solar panels to his kids' toys.
And now the thing will make bubbles all day long, and you don't have to buy batteries. Weatherproof.
He used to be a roofer and an occasional guest on a local home improvement show, until one summer day when he was installing an electric fan in a sweltering attic.
They took the wire caps off and got shocked, and here you're sweating. You got insulation stuck to your skin, and it's 140 degrees, and I was like, there's got to be a better way.
This better way? A solar-powered fan to pull hot air out of that attic, using the sun to cool a house, or an office, or the Honolulu airport. Yes, Bill's $500 fans are huge in Hawaii and California, the Caribbean and Spain. And his idea is now a $4 million a year business.
I can show you my records for the last 6 years and show that it's like a 45-degree angle straight up. Our growth, that's without an incentive. What would happen if an incentive got put into place? We'd have to put a lot more people on, we'd be buying a lot more raw goods.
In this part of America, that can't happen fast enough. No other region has seen unemployment climb higher, faster. So we buys every part possible from suppliers close to home.
Illinois, Pennsylvania, Indiana.
And vows to keep it that way, no matter the cost.
That is a noble attitude. Is that a practical attitude in the 21st century?
Well, according to some of the consultants and experts I've talked to, no. But I'll go down with the ship trying to make the thing here in the U.S.
And he says nothing motivates him like an airplane ride, with his nose pressed against the window.
I'm looking down at rooftops and thinking, there's my field of dreams
There's
right
your
there.
future, right?
That's my future.
Bill Weir, ABC News, Warsaw, Indiana.
Bill Keith, by the way, we just received word that his fans will soon be cooling the Indiana governor.
The governor's mansion. Okay. So Bill Keith, when he started his business, he started his own barn and took out a second mortgage to do so. So to me, he's a story that says, yes, we can start to overcome global warming. We just need this creative entrepreneurial spirit kicking in, which we have in spades here in the United States. Here's an example. This is a Habitat for Humanity home built in Denver. It says zero energy, but actually it produces 25, in the course of the year, produces 25% more energy than it uses. So it's not just a zero energy home, it's a negative energy home. And this is using standard materials, off-the-shelf stuff, nothing fancy. So, I mean, if we can create a zero to negative energy habitat home, we can do that all across the country. Another great thing about, in some ways great, but a tremendous opportunity that we have in terms of this overcoming global warming is that 2/3 of what needs to happen in developing countries. Now that's a tremendous challenge, but from my perspective, it also is a tremendous opportunity. It's a way that we can help folks to create sustainable economic progress with clean energy technologies. And a good chunk of the way that this needs to happen in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions is through better forestation practices. So reducing deforestation and planting more trees. And that's going to have tremendous benefits. Mike can tell us a lot better than I can about all the benefits that can accrue to doing that. So tremendous challenge, tremendous opportunities, and a great opportunity, in my view, for the poor to be able to develop cleanly and sustainably. Another way, a practical, tangible way to tackle this is efficient cook stoves. I call them freedom stoves, and as I go through my bullets, hopefully you'll see why I call them freedom stoves. But 2.5 billion people use very inefficient ways of cooking. And for a lot of these folks, it's like 3 rods over a fire. I mean, it's just very, very primitive. And so a lot of that indoor smoke is very, very harmful to young children. It's the second leading cause of death among young children in these situations. Just about the leading cause, but very close in terms of diarrheal diseases. So not only can we overcome global warming, we can do a lot in terms of indoor air pollution as well. But it uses energy more efficiently, much more efficiently, reduces deforestation, greenhouse gases, and black carbon, improves human health. Again, I was just speaking about that. Reduces time spent collecting fuel. Usually it's women and girls who are collecting the firewood. And for some folks, that can take up to 8 hours a day. But for many around the world, it's going to be like, the spread would be like 2 to 8 hours. What else can they be doing with that time? A lot of other stuff. Increase the family budget and provide local employment. To me, all of these things are ways of increasing freedom. So for me, they're freedom stoves. Another example, and I try to tell as many of these types of stories as I can in the book to provide encouragement for folks. This is a biogas example, creating biogas that then creates, that you can use to burn to create electricity. And this company, Husk Power Systems, a couple of guys from India who were getting their MBAs at UVA were talking one day to another guy here from the United States getting his MBA there at UVA. And they were saying, we want to do something for our families back home. They only have electricity. And maybe we can do some kind of thing for them, nonprofit type of a deal. And the American said, he said, let me do some research on this. And he came here and said, we can make money in this deal. So this is a for-profit business. And I think that's actually the way that most of this is going to be tackled, is through for-profit ventures. But they take rice husks that right now are just left in the fields to rot that creates methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. And they put them in their gasifier and they create biogas and electricity out of it. So this is Chip Ransleer, a quote from him. He says, we take agricultural waste and turn it into electricity, minerals, and carbon credits. The mineral is silica, which is a really valuable mineral, and then they're getting credits, and they're able to sell those carbon credits and make additional profit from that. So here's what they've done just in 3 years. And here's a quote from a villager. We earned our independence from England 60 years ago, but today, when you came to our village, we got our independence from poverty. So, we just looked at overcoming the causes, what's causing it, the pollution that's causing it. The term is mitigation. And now we need to look quickly at overcoming the consequences, or how can we adapt to the consequences of climate change. And the most basic way of doing that, basic understanding, is to enhance people's resilience to what's going to happen to them and reduce their vulnerability. Well, a big way to do that is to enhance their economic standing. And so a great deal of what we've been doing in our own relief and development efforts is actually a way of helping people enhance their resilience and reduce their vulnerability. So there's lots of great overlaps here. There's some studies that have shown that if a country has democratic institutions, it's actually going to be more resilient to impacts, and their citizens will become more resilient because they're able to petition their government and say to them, hey, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing in terms of protecting us. So for those countries that don't have democratic institutions, they're going to be less resilient and more vulnerable. Again, education is a key to economic progress for folk, and so it's a key to enhancing resilience and reducing vulnerability. We need the rule of law to make sure that all the programs are happening, as well as, you need without a rule of law, you can't have a robust economy. And all of this is wrapped in, again, to sustainable economic progress. All of these things are stuff we're already in favor of doing. So this is kind of like no-brainer time. Another example in terms of creating that sustainable economic progress I have in the book is this company in Tanzania, Katani, and them using the sisal. Here we have a field of sisal. And this is it's a drought-resistant, year-round cash crop. And all those things make it something that's incredibly resilient to the impacts of climate change. But it's something that, irrespective of climate change, they were already doing. And here's the type of products that can be created out of sisal. You probably have bought some of these products, but ropes, twines, yarn, paper, you can see all the things that can be made there. And as I said, a drought-resistant year-round cash crop. One of the great things about sisal is that you can intercrop it with food crops, and it creates an organic fertilizer. And one example has maize yields going up by 200%. The thing is about all of that is that only 4% of the plant is used for the products. So 6% of it can be turned into biogas that they're now using for electricity for their hospital and schools. So that's a great example of what's going on out there. Another great example of how we can adapt is to get better at preparing for natural disasters. Example of Bangladesh. They had some terrible hurricanes hit there in 1791. 500,000 and 140,000 people died. They created a disaster preparedness program, and when the same intensity of storm hit in 2007, less than 4,000 people died. So there's a lot of great things that can be done to have incredible success. Another just very practical thing, flood-resistant housing. And you can see, easily replaceable materials, thirsty plants. I mean, all this is just very practical, low-tech, easy to do. but can make a big difference in people's lives. So, because we're talking about the freedom from the impacts and freedom from poverty, I consider global warming the next great cause of freedom. But how will we find the world? It's a marathon that we're running, that we'll be running the rest of our lives. How are we going to be sustained as we run this race? Well, we're going to be sustained by walking with the risen Lord. And that's a lot of what I talk about in my book. I think I'll skip over these. So, in following the risen Lord and overcoming global warming, it will involve what I talk about in the book is the 5 great loves. And that's loving others as He has loved us, loving our neighbors as ourselves, loving our enemies, loving the least of these, and loving God back, which encompasses all of the other great loves. So, overcoming global warming is not really about the technologies. It's about love and grace and faithfulness and freedom and spiritual beauty and glory. So we'll stop there. So, ready?
Yep.
I don't know if you need to use that or not, but maybe for the purposes of the recording, probably do. Okay, so you got into this a little bit right at the end. I'm still wanting you connect the dots a little bit more for us on what does any of this have to do with being a Christian?
Well, again, when you look at the impacts and who they're going to happen to, and you look then at the teachings of Jesus, and that we're to love our neighbors, we're to care for the least of these. For me, it's a pretty simple equation there, that the poor are going to be impacted the hardest. They have done essentially nothing to create these conditions, and yet they're going to suffer these situations. And I mean, irrespective of that justice component there, which is a strong one, for Christians, just even if we hadn't been part of creating this situation, that they simply find themselves in it, that the love of Christ in our own hearts should be enough of an impetus for us to say, yes, indeed, the Lord is with them in the ditch of these impacts, and that's where we need to be too.
So you're saying as an expression of our faith, really concern about climate change, global warming is actually an expression of our love for others.
Definitely.
Okay. I thought, as I read Genesis, I thought it was our job to just dominate and name stuff and populate. I don't see anything there about saying take care of it.
It's interesting. I discussed that in the book. And you could look at this issue and say, in one sense, yeah, but I'm talking about people. Since you've shifted to say, oh, it's about this other stuff,
yeah. Right?
That's the implication of your
Exactly.
your remark.
Sure.
And so I'm saying, did I say anything about the other stuff? I'm talking about the poor.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing. But the scriptures don't let us, even in the sense of how important helping the poor is in the scriptures, which is one of the major themes of scripture. And the reason it's there, in my own view, is that not that God loves the poor more than He loves the rest of us. He loves them as much as He loves us. And because they're getting a raw deal, that's why He's concerned about them. If we suddenly became poor ourselves, He'd be concerned about our situation. Mm-hmm. So, that is a huge theme, but there is also this important theme in the Scripture that has been misinterpreted in terms of we are called to care for the rest of creation. And I talked about this a little bit in Harry's class this morning. One of the texts that was up on the screen this morning during worship was Colossians 1:15 and 16. And that's part of a text that goes to verse 20. And the 20th verse says, "And all things have been reconciled by his blood shed on the cross." And so our own reconciliation to God is wrapped up in the reconciliation of all things. It can't be separated out. And the reason why that text starts out with this in verse 15. He, Christ, he is the image of the invisible God. Now that is, when you see that word image, bells should be going off in your head. Because where have I heard image before, right? Well, it's in Genesis 1, right? The text that you're talking about. And verse 16 in Colossians goes on to say, all things have been created by him and for him.
It's the for him that you really land on in your book.
Yes.
And so you connect this idea of all things being created for him, therefore we should be involved in taking care of all the things that were being created for him. Right?
Yes.
Is that where you're headed?
One of the ways that the first chapter of Genesis has been, I think, really distorted in terms of it's been proof text to be able to say, as you said at the beginning, we can dominate. We can.
That's our job. We were told to.
Yeah, dominion means domination, right? And then, but in chapter 2 of Genesis, it's tend and keep. And so a lot of folks have kind of like said, well, we're going to find this balance between these two, dominating and tending and keeping. Sometimes maybe we do one, sometimes the other. I then asked the question in my book, are we just kind of almost disinterested observers who are objectively looking at these texts, or are we reading them as followers of the risen Lord, as followers of the suffering servant, who what is his example to us? You serve others. You serve the slaves. That's Jesus washing the feet of the disciples. So with Jesus as our example, I posit that there's no way that we can then go back and read Genesis and say, oh, we get to dominate other things. No, we're just served. We're just served. The least of these, those without power. And that includes the rest of creation.
Okay, but if you believe, as Reverend Camping does, for instance, that the world, which was supposed to end in June, but he miscalculated and now it's going to end in November. But so who cares? Why if the end of the world is around the corner?
Right.
Why are you wasting everybody's time? As I hear the arguments sometimes, and I'm not making this up. What does any of this stuff that you just said have to do with saving souls? This should be about saving souls, some of these people say, and
right.
you're just one big distraction.
You're exactly right. If the logic is inescapable, if what we're supposed to be about is saving these quote-unquote souls that go to this ethereal place called heaven for eternity, if that's what it's about, then you're exactly right.
You think that's not what it's about?
No. It's again, the logic is inescapable. It's just not biblical. Jesus talked about the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
Right? That was the thing he talked about the most. And what is the kingdom? Essentially, a real interpretive key for understanding what is the kingdom is right there in the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. So heaven is an existence where God's will is done continuously and completely.
Mm-hmm.
And we were created to actually do that here on earth. So our abode is really here on earth. What is the title of my book, Global Warming and the Ethereal, Bodiless Being of Jesus. No, it is Global Warming and the Risen Lord. What is our hope? Our hope is not to be playing harps, ethereal beings playing harps somewhere up in the clouds. No, our hope is that there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, and that our real future is on this transformed earth. That's where the kingdom of God is going to ultimately and become a reality. Right now, we're in this situation, already not yet kind of situation, where Jesus is the inbreaking of the kingdom. He did the Father's will completely.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what the kingdom is.
Mm-hmm.
He was the embodiment of, he was a walking around kingdom.
Right.
And so as we image him, that's our job, is to be images of God, be images, in other words, of Christ, because that's doing God's will continuously and completely, and therefore the kingdom has come when that happens. So our job is to image Christ with our own personalities. And therefore, in imaging Christ, we take care of our other folk, and we take care of the rest of creation as God would. That's what it means to be the image.
Okay. Now, there are other people who would say that all of this talk about global warming is kind of denying history. We've always gone through these cycles in the planet of it heats up and then it cools down, it heats up and it cools down. You're putting this in more apocalyptic kinds of terms. And so the critics who would say, come on, this is just one of the cycles that the planet has gone through in millions of years. How do you know that this isn't just one of those cycles?
Right.
One politician called this whole thing just a big hoax.
Right. Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma.
That's the guy.
My friend Jim. It's interesting because many Republicans now are picking up and using the term hoax. Some of the Republican presidential candidates have picked up on that word. I am a consumer of good scientific products. I myself am not a scientist. But as someone who is a moral decision maker, whether it deals with public policy or my own personal life, scientific evidence is especially in areas of public policy, is perhaps the most important part of kind of doing the spade work in the groundwork. To say, okay, there seems to be a problem. How are we going to know that it actually is a problem? Well, we have to look at it and study it scientifically. And the way that our country has decided, until folks really started slamming fairly recently, but how we're going to adjudicate these scientific situations is through calling on the National Academy of Sciences and these major scientific bodies to look at these issues,
Sure.
which they've done numerous times. And so the collective reports, and ever since 1995, with the second assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they have said that human beings are causing global warming, and that essentially there's a over 90% probability that that's the case. Well, if you were to go to the doctor and you had a fever, and he said, well, there's a over 90% probability that it's this, and then a politician said, but no, I don't believe that. And
fevers come and go.
Yeah, fevers coming. I mean, the human body, the temperature of the human body, there's a homeostasis to that.
Right.
And your temperature, you take your temperature at 4 in the morning, it's going to be different than it is at 4 in the afternoon. There's natural flexibility,
Right.
variability.
Right.
So, but what we're doing is we're giving the planet a fever. It's not just that we're going through that natural stuff. We've given the planet a fever, and it's, I mean, in one sense, it's an incredibly complex system. We have to give, due to that. But no one, I don't think I've seen anybody deny that global warming is a greenhouse gas, that it's a heat trapping gas, and we are pumping this heat trapping gas up in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
So even just kind of basic common sense would say that's probably going to mean that things are going to start to heat up.
Yeah.
So unless you have real compelling evidence to the contrary, I think you need to say to yourself, all these scientific reports from the world's leading scientists and the leading scientists here in the United States are saying this is a profound, serious problem. So for me, that then says this is clear and compelling, situation where we need to start acting. If it turns out that they exaggerate, it wasn't quite it. Actually, I think they've been conservative.
Yeah.
I think it's going to actually be even worse than what the major reports are saying. But let's say that they were off a bit or even wrong. Well, we've created a clean energy revolution, clean energy economy, reduced a lot of pollution, created a lot of sustainable jobs, reduced our dependence on foreign oil.
Made life better for these countless folks who had no choice.
Exactly. We've given them technologies that are decentralized technologies that don't rely on centralized grid systems. If there's ever a type of energy that a conservative ought to be in favor of, renewable energy is literally decentralized power. And that's what conservatives want to see.
Yeah,
Decentralized power. They don't like centralized.
Political power.
Yeah.
Right.
So.
All right, I'm going to ask Jim one more question, and then I'd like to broaden this out to anything that would be of interest to you all. So be thinking about what you'd like to ask him. But in our history, especially in this country, it seems like smart people in business have figured stuff out. You got this guy that we just showed, with solar powered fans, and so what makes you think that we can't just trust business to figure this out?
Right. It's the rate of change that needs to occur. As I said in one of the bullet points, we need a tenfold increase in carbon productivity. We've had a comparable tenfold increase, something analogous in terms of can we do something like this? And it was in the Industrial Revolution. It was basically kind of like in terms of just simply productivity.
Right.
And so there was, over the course of about 150 years, there was a tenfold increase in our productivity. But we've got to cram that into 40 years. So our approach, EEN's approach is, okay, we need to actually tap into the dynamics of the market, but we need to give the market some guidance.
Sure.
And say, let's put a price on carbon. Let's start raising the price. Right now, it doesn't have a price. It's zero cost to putting stuff up into the atmosphere. It's what economists call a negative externality. It's something where the producer, neither the producer nor the consumer have to bear that cost, but somebody else does. And so that's currently what's happening right now. Primarily it's the poor who are having to bear that cost.
Yeah.
And will continue to have to bear that cost. And so the concept of putting a price on carbon says we're going to actually start to incorporate that cost into the cost of doing business.
Yeah.
And once that price signal is there, I am convinced we have history to show with the Clean Air Act and the ozone, Montreal Protocol, the ozone treaty, that once you do this, at a certain point, learning curves and economies of scale kick in, and the marketplace actually races past whatever the targets were that the politicians have put in place. In the early years, those targets are a bit onerous, but that then spurs people to say, you know what, I don't have to incur this cost, and I get an advantage of being a business as I reduce those costs. So it's really the dynamics of the marketplace that are really going to be the thing that solves this, but the market needs to have that price signal.
Yeah.
And so in order for that price signal to happen, you actually have to have a law passed where it's either a fee or a cap and trade system or something like that puts the price on carbon.
Okay.
And that's the way, in my view, we're actually going to solve this. Let the market solve it, but you need to give the market the price signal.
Got it, got it. Okay. So you've been listening to this. What do you want to know? Go ahead.
I want to say thank you for kind of speaking with us. I know we'll appreciate it. And my question is, with like regards to all the other issues outside of global warming, like hunger, like we talked about, like the shortage of clean water, like human trafficking, what was it that made you want to kind of apply your work to like a less direct way of fighting poverty?
Yeah. I guess for me it's a very direct way of doing it. But I see what you mean by kind of less direct. But it's so many of the things that, like, so you mentioned human trafficking, hunger,
Water shortage. Yeah, just
Right.
examples.
Yeah, so global warming is going to make all those worse. So if you care about those things, then you need to care about global warming, because global warming is going to make all of those situations harder, worse. It's going to increase those things that you mentioned. So for me, that's a direct connection. It's this intensifier effect, as I talked about earlier. But I wasn't, I spoke about this a bit in Harry's class. When I was in seminary, I was kind of part of the peace and justice crowd, and concerned about hunger and those types of issues, war, the weapons. And I didn't grow up an environmentalist, or, a lot of folks kind of love being out in the natural world, which I do, but my family didn't go camping or these types of things. For a lot of folks in our community, that's some of the ways that they get into this issue of creation theory. That wasn't me. I was having a conversation with a fellow student when we were both in our first semesters of getting our PhDs. Typical conversation, I'm sure you guys had very similar conversations, like, what's your major? She's like, I said to her, well, what are you here to study? And she said, I'm here to study a Christian approach to nature. And I literally said to her, why would you waste your time doing that? There's all these other big issues out there to be concerned about. And I taunted her. I knew that she had a son, and I saw an ant crawling along the ground. And I said, are you telling me that this son is as important or more important than, this ant is as important or more important than your son? More valuable? Well, she didn't take the bait. And she ignored my...
It's not a very Christian way to approach
rudeness,
this.
yes.
Brewed does come to mind.
And, but she said back to me, she said, well, you're an evangelical. Why don't you read the Bible and like this question? And it was when I came to Colossians 1:15-20 that I was convicted that I had missed it. I missed this part of Scripture. And it was because I was part of, for me, the reconciliation was such a huge thing, peace and justice. And I saw the reconciliation of all things by His blood shed on the cross. And for me, the emotional heart of my faith is that the blood of Jesus saves me from all of my sins. And so I was just thoroughly convicted by that verse that I had missed this. Once I started then reading about quote-unquote environmental issues, I came upon this issue of climate change. About 1992, I started seriously looking at it. And I realized then that the impacts were going to fall hardest on the poor. And they had done nothing to cause it. And so my concerns about peace and justice and hunger then were, all of a sudden I saw, well, these aren't separate. You know, care for God's creation, these issues of pollution, this is not separate from all the things I was already concerned about. So hopefully my perspective has been deepened, enhanced, I've got a wider vision. But that, I hope that kind of addresses some of your questions. Did I get at it for you?
Yeah, I think so. So just like I don't know, like if you could like short answer, like why was it that you?
Oh, a short answer.
Yeah. I mean, you like touched on it, but I guess. Yeah, I don't know, because it's something that I'm really interested in, is like these environmental issues, but I have a hard time like fully committing my life to it, or like taking on this career, knowing that there are these immediate needs.
Right. And I guess I would just say to you that all these things are intimately connected up with how we as human beings can either be diminished or enhanced in terms of living our lives. And for me, the manna in the wilderness story is a perfect picture of the sufficiency and contentment that our lives are supposed to be about. Because when folks went out there, they gathered it up, but nobody had too much and nobody had too little. And I think that's really what God really wants, the place where God wants to get for all human beings. And we don't want to have too much. That hurts us. We don't want to have too little. And so all these concerns and issues I've had, peace and justice and hunger and the poor, global warming is going to make the situation where those who have too little, they're going to get even littler, So for me, it's all a part of the same thing.
Good, we've got time for another question or two before we have to run. What's on your mind? Go ahead.
Just going back to the critics saying the global warming might be just another phase because it's fluctuated over history. I was wondering whether or not they're right, would it not make much of a difference because the casualties or just the impacts would be so much greater than it would have in the past, either because of such a greater population or other things that have changed now from when it used to be? Would it not make a difference? Is my question. What the cause is, I guess.
I don't know if I'm quite following. I listed a bunch of impacts. You're saying and there's going to be serious numbers associated with that, right?
Right. Well, depending, because the global warming that's happening could be natural or human caused by human or natural causes. Would it make a difference what the cause is?
That's an interesting question. Does it even matter what the cause of this is?
Well, in the sense of helping the poor adapt to the consequences, kind of the consequences that are going to happen in the next couple of decades, probably not. Because, usually critics will acknowledge that the earth has warmed up and that's causing consequences. It's because honestly they don't want to do the things we need to do to reduce our burning of fossil fuels. That's where they don't want to then say, oh, it's humans that are causing it. But even if you don't espouse a human causation, but you do then say that the earth is warming up and there are going to be these consequences, then as Christians, and I would say to anyone who's of that perspective, you still need to be wanting, you're still called to do something to help these poor folk adapt to the consequences that you yourself are saying are going, the warming is going to help create these things. You're you're going along with that. So the impacts that I'm just kind of doing a quick kind of like back in the envelope, let's say, kind of about 2/3 of those impacts that maybe half to 2/3 would probably be what, if you didn't think it was human induced, would occur, let's say. That's a lot of both. And a lot of things need to occur. The reason why the human induced is so important is because if you think it's natural variability, then you'll probably think that it's what goes up must come down, right? And then it's, or we could wait it out, or plenty of excuses for not doing something, right? I mean, we're creative beings, and we can be creative in terms of not wanting to do something. So where it's really important to really acknowledge that it is human induced is the impacts that I showed up on the screen. We could actually, if we really get at reducing the emissions, we could cut those impacts, let's say, by about 1/3, right? But 2/3 are still going to happen. It's built in. It's going to occur. But those numbers I put up were kind of mid-range, even conservative estimates. If we don't start reducing our emissions we need to have our emissions peak, worldwide emissions peak by 2015. If we don't start getting to that point, then there's a chance that the world will go past some threshold points. And then what will happen is feedback loops will kick into place, like huge fields of methane up in the Siberian wasteland would be released, kind of thing. And then you have this self-fulfilling thing going on, and a bit of a kind of a runaway effect. And if that type of stuff starts happening, then much worse impacts will happen. Stuff that I don't even want to speculate. So this is the reason why the human-induced idea is a really important one, because if we think we can just keep pumping this stuff up there, then we're going to see consequences that are much worse than what I've outlined.
Final question for anybody? Yeah, go ahead.
In my opinion, the average American just doesn't care about this issue without financial incentive or it affecting their everyday life directly. Do you think it's possible for significant enough financial incentive to exist to motivate someone, to motivate this country as a whole to do something about this issue without significant tax incentives or reform?
Well, that's the putting a price on carbon idea. I believe that until we do that, we won't be serious as a country in terms of solving this issue. That's why we've been fighting so hard as an organization to have some kind of price on carbon occur. Because think about our Christian community, and do we all do the right thing all the time as Christians, consistently in the way that needs to happen to address this issue? This issue really, is there a comparable kind of situation? And honestly, the answer is no. So, as a society, and my own understanding of our human finitude says we need that price signal. But we're going to need folks who not only respond to the price signal, but are also taking it a step further, or who are kind of saying, what else can we do, are really pushing it forward even more. And that's where Christians need to come in, and others of goodwill. Because the price signal it's not going to take us the whole way there that we need to go. We're still going to need folks who say, for those who love others, as a Christian or as whatever way you choose to look, believe that or think that, for those who love others, this is something that we have to do. And so we need both the price signal and we need the love. We need both of these.
Good way to end. Would you thank Jim Ball for being with us?
A special thank you to our own Dr. Dean Nelson from the Journalism School.
I forgot to mention, Jim Ball, if you received a book, we can pass it out to you in the beginning. That's a gift from the Evangelical Environmental Network. If you did not, there are copies in the back, and Jim has set a very discounted price, $10 or usually $25, so definitely pick one up in the back then if you receive a copy.
And I'm happy to sign the books if you want me to sign them.
Cool.
Have a good night. It's coming.